Hello, everyone. Click that recording. We are recording this webinar, so you will get a little box that asks if that's okay with you. If so, please click yes. My name is Peggy Nielsen. I am the program manager for Sandcastle's Grief Support Program in Detroit, Michigan. Welcome to our webinar. We are happy to have with us Michelle Holm. She is a friend and NACG member and with us in this mission to help serve grieving children and families. So a little bit of an introduction. Michelle is the director of Buddy's Place and the school-based partnerships at Pillars Community Health. Before joining Pillars Community Health in Chicago, she was a high school social studies teacher and completed her counseling internship in Chicago's public schools, high schools. Michelle is an active member of the National Alliance for Children's Grief and is a member of the Volunteer Coordinator Group and the School-Based Provider Group. She has also been part of the work groups that have created the NACG's School Resource Toolkit and the just recently released Suicide Resource Guide. She has also been selected to be part of the review committee for the Children and Funerals Resource Guide in development. Michelle has been a featured panelist on the topic of grief in schools and was the fall 2022 keynote speaker at the 6th annual school-based mental health roundtable, which was sponsored by River Edge Hospital and Cicero School District 99 in Illinois, and has presented at the Illinois School Counselor Association. I had the pleasure of listening to her on that roundtable, and it was a wonderful presentation, and that is how we have asked her here tonight with us. So thank you for coming, Michelle, and thank you for being our presenter.
Sure, thank you for having me. So I'm gonna share my screen. Peggy, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that?
Yep.
Okay. Hopefully the sound is enabled as well. Welcome everyone. So tonight I'm gonna be presenting on Becoming Grief Informed, a focus on schools and community. Schools and community are kind of the benchmarks, and we interact with them so much on a daily basis, and especially our children are in and out of them on an almost daily basis as well. So November is Children's Grief Awareness Month, so I'm grateful to be able to present in this month. As Peggy said, we are both members of the National Alliance for Children's Grief, NACG.org, and we invite you to check out their website this month, and their campaign this year is Listen on Repeat. And we'll be talking about listening as well. Kind of something to get us started. So we will never be 100% proficient in grief, but we need to make sure that we lead and learn with grief humility. So we will make mistakes when we're interacting with those on their grief journey. We need to be good to ourselves. Sometimes we don't know what to say. And so just saying that is the best thing we can say. Megan Devine, who some of you might be familiar with, she has podcasts and the website Refuge in Grief, says, "Of course you feel awkward. You haven't been taught how to help. Bearing witness to someone's pain without jumping in to fix it or make it better is a skill, and skills can be learned." So hopefully tonight we'll give you a little bit of foundational information that you can then build upon with many of the resources that we will share. So without further ado, to understand why this topic is important, we first need to understand how many children are grieving. In Judy's House JAG Institute in Denver, Colorado, with the generous support of the New York Life Foundation, funding much of the research, has released the Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model. And through this CBEM, they have found that 1 in 13 children across the United States will be impacted by the death of a parent or a sibling by the age of 18. That is not grandparent, that is not aunt, uncle, cousin, neighbor, best friend. That is a parent or sibling will die in their life by the age of 18 for 1 in 13 children. In the state of Michigan, the number is 1 in 11. So if you think on graduation day in May, that's at least 2 children in every senior class. So this is impactful. It is a social determinant of health. It should be considered an ACE, adverse childhood experience, and it is important to understand. These numbers also double by the age of 25. So I just want to share a short video clip from Judy's House JAG Institute that expand a little bit on this research.
Long overlooked, childhood bereavement is a critical issue nationwide. According to the Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model, or CBEM, 1 in 13 children in the US will experience the death of a parent or sibling by age 18. This represents an increase of more than 700,000 children since the CBEM was initially developed in 2018. Created by Judy's House JAG Institute with philanthropic support from New York Life Foundation, the CBEM approximates rates of US children and youth who will experience the death of a parent or sibling by the time they reach adulthood. 2022 CBEM results are the first to include a complete data set from 2020, giving us an early look at the direct and indirect impacts of the pandemic on childhood bereavement. In recent years, mortality rates for adults ages 27 through 46 increased significantly. Deaths by accidents, homicide, heart disease, diabetes, suicide, and COVID-19 increased the most, leaving many children and families to navigate the difficult realities of grief. Experiencing a significant death during childhood often results in profound stress and adversity that can derail a child's development. However, providing appropriate support to a grieving child can ease the impact and help keep a child's development on track. Now more than ever, access to comprehensive, grief-focused, trauma-informed care and resources is critical for the well-being of every bereaved child. In order to provide this support, we need to know how many children are grieving. According to 2022 CBEM results, 7.7% of all children in the United States will become bereaved by age 18. That's more than 5.6 million children across the country. And that number more than doubles to over 13.9 million youth by age 25. Childhood bereavement rates vary between the states. Although California has the lowest rate, with an estimated 5.9% of children becoming bereaved, this represents more than 500,000 children. While a staggering 12.4% of children in West Virginia are estimated to experience the tragic loss of a parent or sibling. Every day, you encounter youth journeying through grief in your community. The demand for comprehensive grief care is high, but resources are scarce. By accessing CBEM data and tools, you can elevate childhood bereavement to a critical issue and help every bereaved child find hope and healing.
So those numbers are impactful. And so I'm grateful that Henry Ford Hospice has the Sandcastles program. And throughout the state of Michigan, there are other programs as well. The National Alliance for Children's Grief does have an online resource if you know somebody impacted by a death loss that lists programs throughout the United States that can support children. If you'd like more information on the CBEM, you can visit the Judy's House JAG Institute website, and they recently came out with COVID-19 impact data. They will release their next set of numbers, including the 2021 data early in the spring. And we know already that that number of bereaved children will increase. And so they're not saying by how much, but we know that more children are impacted. So we're thankful that you're here today to learn a little bit more about grief. So we also know that race and ethnicity impact the rates of childhood bereavement. So 1 in 26 Asian Pacific Islanders experience the death of a parent or sibling by the age of 18, 1 in 10 Black African American, and 1 in 21 white or Hispanic, and 1 in 14 white children. And so race and ethnicity is also something to consider when you're providing supports. And we also want to strive to be have cultural humility as well. I know in the past there's been a lot of talk about cultural competence, but even in the same family, people will grieve differently based on their interpretation of their culture. And so it's really important that we ask them individually, how their culture, their race, and their ethnicity impact their grief journey.
Childhood bereavement is an issue that has profound impacts on youth, families, and communities. Recent results from the Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model, or CBEM, show that 1 in 14 children in the US will experience the death of a parent or sibling before their 18th birthday. Taking a closer look at the data, the CBEM reveals significant differences in prevalence rates based on race and ethnicity. The numbers are truly astounding. Nationally, American Indian or Alaska Native children are bereaved at rates above the US average. And bereavement is most prevalent for Black or African American children, where 1 in 10 will experience the death of a parent or sibling by age 18, nearly 1.5 times the national rate. CBEM race and ethnicity results also highlight regional discrepancies. For example, in South Dakota, 1 in 13 children will experience the death of a parent or sibling by age 18. But for American Indian youth in the state, the prevalence grows to an astonishing 1 in 5 youth. That means these children are more than 2.5 times more likely to lose a parent or sibling than the state rate. Unaddressed grief can derail a child's development. Bereaved children are at risk for social, emotional, behavioral, and academic stressors that can have long-term consequences. Providing grief care can reduce the impact of these stressors and put a child back on track toward healthy growth and development. Grief is as diverse as our nation. We must advocate for quality grief care services that can address the staggeringly disproportionate rates of bereavement among youth and can help them feel supported as they navigate the ups and downs of loss. While resources are limited, you can make a difference for grieving children and families. Learn how children in your community are differentially impacted by death loss by visiting Judy's House JAG Institute online.
And so one more video. So I'm going to ask, what if we got better at grief? What if we got better at understanding? What if we got better at talking or speaking grief?
There's something we don't talk about, even though it affects each of us, all of us. It's something we carry wherever we go, the inevitable result of losing the people we love. That something is grief. Even if we're not grieving now, we carry the knowledge that someday death and grief will visit us and the people we care about. But we try so hard to avoid it. We try to shut it out. We mean well, but we don't know the right words to bring comfort. Far too often, we simply say nothing. We need to get better at grief.
So that's the beginning of an amazing documentary, Speaking Grief, and it's publicly available online at speakinggrief.org, and they also have wonderful resources. So I would love if everyone would take some time, and you can watch it in segments, but it's definitely worth watching and then reflecting on how grief impacts you and how you can be a support, or how you might not be able to support, which is completely fine as well, to someone who is on a grief journey. And while we're going to be talking mostly about death-related losses tonight, because that's kind of the supports that sandcastles and other programs like sandcastles provide support for, we must acknowledge that there's other non-death losses as well. So about 50% of married couples in the United States in partnered relationships will end in an uncoupling, to use Gwyneth Paltrow's term, or a divorce. And that's impactful on children. 1 in 28 children experience the incarceration of a parent, and many of those youth do not have the ability to visit that parent. And there's also immigration and refugee. In the migratory process of refugees, there's 7 different types of grief that they'll encounter: military deployments, relocations, changes in the family structure or something in their life, changes in routines, kids going from kindergarten or part-time school to all-day school, either in kindergarten or first grade, high school seniors graduating and then moving on to post-secondary education or leaving the home to live on their own. Those are all different phases and changes in routine in life. And then oftentimes, just as impactful as the primary loss is a secondary loss, which is losses that are a result of the first loss, but they might be financial, they might be social, they might be spiritual, and they can change the way that our life and the trajectory of our life move forward. And there is a cost if we do nothing. So this information is also from Judy House JAG Institute. So we know that if we do not address childhood grief and trauma, it can lead to both short and long-term difficulties, including decreased academic performance, mental health issues, and early mortality. It also impacts our communities with productivity, employment, and other social expectations. And so if we just sat and did nothing, grief would be something that could be impactful, but we know that we have supports. And so by providing those supports that can help with healthy development, that can provide support in caring and listening and understanding and protective factors, we bump up those, costs of inactions are going up, and with that support, we can drive them down. And so we know not everyone will be impacted by severe detrimental consequences due to the loss, but it can be impactful. And so we must recognize that as well. So some common language before we move forward. So what is grief? So grief is very paradoxical. It's universal, but yet it's very individual. We will all be impacted by death loss. It's the only universal that we really have. But each of us will experience it very, very differently. Grief is a normal, expected, and natural response to loss. It is not only emotional, it is with your whole being, including physical, behavioral, cognitive, social, and spiritual reactions. Your relationships might change. How you view yourself and others might change. The activities that you participate in will likely change. A meaningful attachment to someone that was important to you has been broken. And present during any time of change, even during our happiest moments. Grief is a lifelong journey. Many say it's the price we pay for caring or for loving, and it is something that we will carry. It is not time limited. It does not have an end date, but it will change as we move forward through our lives. Some other terms that we use oftentimes in this: loss. So loss is kind of a word that, depending on who you're speaking about, we can use, or there's sometimes better terms. So the loss is the disappearance of something cherished. When we're speaking about those impacted by a death loss, especially when we're talking to children, we like to use the words death, died, and dead because they're more concrete and they provide better understanding and less ambiguity. Grief is the normal multifaceted reaction to a loss that we just talked about. Bereavement is the process of adjusting to a loss. So think about some of the policies and things we have. Do we give ourselves adequate time for bereavement, both in workplaces, in schools, in our own lives? The answer probably is no. So that's definitely something to consider. And then mourning is the verb. It's the culturally structured response to grief. So grief itself is kind of an internal construct, and mourning is an external construct. So when we think sometimes of mourning, we might expect somebody to wear an armband or wearing black or to be showing certain emotions. And so it's something that we can often see. And so that's why, when people say, well, they're not grieving, we can't see inside them, but we can tell more easily if they might be mourning. So there's also some universal truths, right? So death is irreversible. All life functions end completely at the time of a death. So when we're speaking with children, we can explain that when the heart stops working, the body stops feeling things, the blood stops circulating, and all of the functions that happen in the body stop. Everything that is alive eventually dies. As we're working with children or youth, this is a great concept to introduce to them, even starting at an early age. Oftentimes we'll see a bird that might have fallen out of a tree, or some, cicadas or insects or other creatures that have died on the side of a sidewalk or in the lawn. And oftentimes we, kind of push our children along and don't look at that. But that's actually a time where we can stop and explain what happened. We can introduce them to the concept of death. And so we're starting to build that vocabulary with them, so that then when they experience the death of a person, they have some concepts of what that actually means. There are also physical reasons why someone dies. So those are 4 concepts about death. There's many factors that influence our grief experiences. So the relationship with the person who died, you might have been very close, or you might have been estranged. You might have been beloved or ambivalent. The circumstances of the death. One's not easier or harder, they're just different. Was it sudden, or was it expected? Or was it expected at some point but happened suddenly? What are the supports and assistance that's available in the community and resources that are accessible? Just because there might be programs in a community does not mean that they're accessible. So we need to make sure that we find supports that can be accessed as well. What's the personality of both the griever and the deceased? What are our past experiences with death and other losses? Physical health is something that people often ask questions about. Were they sick? How old were they? What stage of life were they in? Again, to the person grieving the loss, a youth or an older adult are both impactful. And age does not determine the significance of the loss. Culture and how that figures into how they grieve, or memorials or services or traditions that might be followed, or that they might have chosen to not follow. And then finally, faith and spiritual beliefs. So it's multi-contextual. It's very deep and it's very nuanced, and it can be very different to people even in the same family. My mouse is really touchy. So there's some myths about grief, right? So sometimes we hear, they should be over it by now. It's been a year. And there is not a certain time that it takes to get over it. In fact, we don't ever really get over it. We work through it. Time doesn't heal all things. If we avoid the pain, it won't hurt. that's just when we stuff it down, but it still is inside us, right? Crying makes things worse. Crying is an emotional release, and it can make people feel better. It could make them feel worse in that moment as well. But if we don't let our grief out in healthy ways, then it will find other maladaptive ways to surface. Talking about loss makes it worse. As you heard in the video clip, often when we say nothing, that's the worst thing we can do. Getting angry won't help. Might not help, but it might make me feel a little better, right? Another myth is, I shouldn't bother anyone with my pain. Oftentimes there are people that are willing to bear witness to your pain, but finding those people can be difficult, but it isn't impossible. And when you find that person, that's someone you hold on tight to. And other programs, support programs as well, can be impactful. If I'd only had faith, I wouldn't be struggling so much. No, not true. If I can't get over this loss, I will never be happy again. Grief comes in waves, and happiness is part of that experience, right? And people don't understand that. They're like, how can they be laughing? Have you ever been to a funeral or a memorial service and you've heard people laughing? More than likely, yes, right? Isn't that supposed to be a place where we're sad? But we have laughter and we have joy in our memories. If I begin really living again, I'm dishonoring the lost loved one. And grief is a terrible emotion. Nope, it's a natural emotion. So there's some theories that we hear oftentimes in our social environments on how grief works. And oftentimes we'll hear about the 5 stages of grief. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross provided seminal research on those dying, not for those who had died. And so she even said with her research looking back that it shouldn't be applied to bereavement after someone's died. And so we know better now, so we do better now. But the 5 stages of grief are still held up as kind of a cultural norm and an expectation, and it's not true. So we don't grieve in stages. So stages is doing one thing and then the next thing and then the next thing and the next thing, and then we're done. And there's a bow on the end. When we speak to those that are grieving and they get to the stage of acceptance and they're like, whew, I've accepted the loss. I'm ready to move on. And they go into the grocery store or they walk into a department store and they smell the smell of cologne or perfume, or they see the box of Cocoa Pebbles on the shelf and they're overcome with grief. They wonder, what did I do wrong? I thought I was at the stage of acceptance, but now I'm back at denial or bargaining or anger. And they don't understand. But we know that it's not a linear process. It's kind of like a wave that ebbs and flows, or I like to think of an oscillating fan. You know, those beautifully windy oscillating fans that work so well sometimes, but they get stuck, right? They go back and forth. So that's our grief. We have the loss-orientated side where we're doing our grief work. Intrusion of grief, we're breaking those bonds that we have with the deceased. And then we oscillate back over to the restoration orientation. That's where we're getting up, we're going to school, we're going to work, we're doing the expected tasks. We might be making new friends, we might be going out for dinners, we're engaging in our life. And we bounce back and forth. And sometimes you can bounce back and forth as quick as a ping pong game. Other times it's a slow process. And other times, like those fans, you get stuck and it's like, and you're stuck in one space. And then you might have someone give you a nudge and you start moving back and forth. But sometimes that fan gets stuck and somebody kind of pushes it and it doesn't work again, doesn't move back and forth. And they push it again and it's still stuck. Well, that's when we might need to take it and get somebody to look at it. And that would be the same with people. When we get stuck and we try to nudge them so they can start moving back and forth between the 2 orientations and it just doesn't work, that's when we might need some professional clinical supports. And about 10% of people need clinical support. in the work that I do at Buddy's Place, we also do a lot with continuing bonds. So we know that death ends a life, but not a relationship. So many of the projects and things that we do are bringing the loved one or the special person back into the life of the child and the family. And so they might bring a photo. They might talk about their person and their favorite food. They might make an ornament. We'll have conversations about their person. And so it's continuing that bond and incorporating into their life in a different non-physical way. And yes, that is normal. And just as we continue those bonds, people might grieve differently. And so there's kind of a spectrum of where we fit. So most of us are blended grievers to some extent, right? And so they used to ascribe some gender stereotypes to these types of grief, but we know that they're not gendered. And so we don't view them that way anymore. So on one hand, you have instrumental grief. And an instrumental griever is somebody who is a physical griever. They're grieved by doing something. It might be the person that organizes the linen closet, alphabetizes the spice rack, is out cleaning the garage, running, going to basketball practice, swimming. It's also the athlete who all of a sudden seems to have superhuman strength and is amazing at their craft. They run faster, scored more baskets, had more tackles. They're processing their grief in a physical manifestation or a more tactile way. On the other end of the spectrum is what we stereotypically see in TV shows and movies, right? I always think of Sally Fields in Steel Magnolias, where she's just sobbing. And so that's kind of in your intuitive griever. They're more emotive. They're more feelings. They want to talk about their grief. In families, you might have people on both sides of that spectrum, and they don't understand, or they're frustrated or overwhelmed by the other person's grief, or they don't think the other person's grieving at all. And so when we're talking with kids, we talk about like heart and head in terms of their process. But even within adults, they don't always see the other person grieving in that way. And the one that's often overlooked is instrumental, and especially in school. So children might start getting really good grades. They might stay after school and go to homework club. They might be throwing themselves into their academics. And people are like, oh my gosh, it's great. Their grades have improved. Like, we have nothing to worry about. But we probably should be asking questions about why has their grades improved, just as we would if their grades started to fall. But if things are going well, if they're going to practice, if they're spending extra time perfecting their craft, if they're excelling in academics, we often don't recognize that or say anything, but we need to be really in tune to it. There's also grieving styles. There's emotional, rational, creative, and blended. And so grief can come out of us in many different ways. So I want to stop really quick and ask, I can't see the chat. Peggy, are there any questions or comments?
Let me check. Actually, I didn't put that up there in the beginning. Not yet.
Okay. If you have
Someone
any
thinks
questions,
your Padlet's really cool. So Michelle did put the Padlet for this into the chat. I'll do it again just in case you came in late.
oh, there's.
Yeah. But if you want, if anyone does have any questions or comments, please feel free to, I'll keep an eye on the chat and I'll let you know.
Okay, perfect. And so I know we're talking a lot about children because, you know, tonight's topic is kind of wrapping around schools and community, and children are often the forgotten grievers. It's Children's Grief Awareness Month, and they're kind of the focus, but so much of this can be applied to adults as well. But children do have a few unique challenges. Even if a death was anticipated or expected, they oftentimes won't feel safe in their world. Can be true for adults as well. They might not understand how could this have happened. And so sometimes we need to have conversations with them over. And that goes along with understanding the death. Now, what do you mean they're dead? Because they're coming to my game tomorrow, right? Or they're gonna pick me up from school. You might have to have those conversations again and again. And when you're having those conversations, You would have them at their level using words that they understand, age-appropriate language, and you would deliver information in small, easy to understand pieces. We need to allow them to mourn the death. They need to physically and emotionally release their grief. And so oftentimes children are the overlooked in terms of grievers. They're too young. They don't understand. They're too young to grieve. Think of a baby when they cry and they're kind of unsettled, and you give them to somebody that they know, you hand them in to be held by someone that loves them or they know well. They oftentimes settle, right? They have that connection. So there's not really anything such as too young to grieve. As soon as there's a tie in a relationship, you're old enough to experience grief. They have the right to be connected to the person who died. We might move photos. We might put them in different spaces. We might ask them which ones that they want to have next to them on their nightstand. But we don't take everything away that they've had. And oftentimes, it is so important for them to be able to experience their childhood. Occasionally, they're parentalized, so they might take on extra roles in the household. If they're age appropriate and introduced slowly, that can be acceptable. But just because a father or a male figure died does not mean that the child becomes the man of the house or the daughter takes on all of the mother's roles. They're still the children, and we need to make sure they are able to experience their childhood. And like I said, they can take on different roles, but they need to be age appropriate. Some central issues that are likely to be prominent in the grief experience is children often wonder, did I cause the person to die? If I had only done my homework every single night when they asked the first time, they wouldn't have been so stressed out and they wouldn't have had a heart attack. They're not correlated. If I'd gone with them to pick up flowers, they wouldn't have been in the car accident. It's not their fault. Children often think that they caused the death of somebody. And so we need to understand why they think that and then have conversations to help them work through those thoughts. Magical thinking can also come into play. Is it going to happen to me? Yes, we all will die, but we take precautions, right? And we live healthy. We eat our vegetables, we go to the doctor, we wear our seatbelts, we look both ways when we're crossing the streets. And yes, while we'll all die, we do things to maintain a healthy life. And you put that in context that's easy for them to understand. You don't start off with, yes, you will die, but you give them that framework, because oftentimes we want to say, no, honey, it's not going to happen to you. But then we have to come back and explain what we really meant by that. So if we can be thoughtful and intentional with our reaction first, that is going to be important. We have family programming as well. And in the adult caregiver group, we always encourage the adults to have conversations with their children. If they die, who is going to take care of them? And the adults are, we always have somebody that's like, you want me to tell my kids that their other parent or caregiver recently died, and you want me to tell them who's going to take care of them if I die? Yeah, we do. Because they're worrying about that. They're thinking about it. It might not be something they're ruminating about, but it has crossed their mind more than likely. And so having a plan and expressing that plan to them is important. And it's also important for you to understand what your plan is. There was a family that came once, and so sometimes we encourage car conversations, right? There's definitely some milestone conversations. And so this father was driving home with his daughter, and she was in the back seat and he was in the front driving, and he said, so I want to let you know that if something happens to me, that I have a plan. And the daughter was like, okay. And so her dad had two siblings, two sisters. One lived locally and the other lived, I think, on the West Coast. And so she had a really good relationship with her aunt on the West Coast, and she got along fine with the aunt that was closer, but her favorite was the one on the West Coast. And so her dad had the conversation with her and said, if I die, you're going to go live with Aunt so-and-so who lived on the West Coast. And the daughter in the back seat, she goes, yes. And the dad was like, what? Like, he was blown away by her reaction. And she said, I was really worried that I would have to live with Aunt so-and-so who lived close to us because this is where I live. And while I like her, I like living with the other aunt much better. And so she was relieved that dad had some insight maybe into what her thoughts were. So having those conversations, and if it's not the person they originally thought of, then have that conversation on why that might be the better fit. And so explaining to them who is going to take care of them is important as well. So there's some typical signs of grief in children and teens. And if you look at this list, I can't think of anything that's missing, right? Shock, surprise, sadness, confusion, nightmares, aches, pains, upset stomach, crying, aggression, isolation, fatigue, insomnia, irritability. Like, everything can be on here emotionally, cognitively, physically, behaviorally, and even socially. So how in the world do we tell when a child is grieving? We have to know the child a little bit, right? And we have to have open conversations with them. And so we might just have a child who's being typical. We might also have a child who's having grief reactions. And some of the best ways to flush that out is to have conversations with them. So one of the activities that we do is we call it a philometer, a feelometer. And so it's, I think of those old fashioned like weather plates where you had rainy, cloudy, and with the littles, we do it in terms of weather as well. Sunny, cloudy, stormy. And there's another one that I'm forgetting right now. And they can then move to what they're feeling. And then we can have conversations. Well, why are you feeling cloudy? Or why are you feeling isolated? Why are you feeling sunny today? Or what is bringing you happiness? And having those conversations. But in that as well, with those, we often will also tell families that it looks like a clock, right? And so we can have one as adults as well. And we can say, you know what? Tonight, between this time and this time, even if I'm working something, if I'm making dinner, no matter what I'm doing, I can stop what I'm doing and give you undivided attention in this time for whatever you want to do. If you want to play cards, if you want to play a game, it might only be 15 minutes, it might be an hour. But then the child knows that there's time that they can come and that they can ask you. Because the world has changed for us, right? Many of people work from home now, or they'll have meetings that they might need to do in the evenings. And so children don't always know when they can approach adults. And so if we give them a sign, it can be as simple as a clock or something, or let them know that between that time, or it could even be like, I have 20 minutes tonight. Here's this card. If you can make a stack of cards on how long you have, and you can put it on the counter, and they can bring it to you and be like, okay, I want my 20 minutes. And you just be with them. That is starting to form open lines of communication that will serve you well, regardless if it's grief related or just development in childhood. Any questions or anything?
Nope, nothing in the chat.
Okay, awesome. So lots of information, I know, but this is also important because if we don't understand how grief shows up, it doesn't knock on the door and ask to come in. It's hidden and embedded in us. And so we kind of need to make space for it as well. So there's different types of grief that show up as well. And so we have seen a lot of them in the past couple of years, right? So cumulative grief. Cumulative grief is when grief stacks on top of it. So you might have the loss of routine. And so let's kind of look at the pandemic, right? You had the loss of going to school and going to work. And then you went back to school and back to work. And then you had some other adaptations. And then you had a new grade. And you might have had friends that went to different schools during that. You had lots of losses of your routines. And then you statistically probably knew somebody that was impacted by COVID or a death loss due to multiple factors. And so that piled on top of it. And then the new world order of the way we do things. And they stack on top of each other and they accumulate, and that can be heavy. We also have cumulative grief. And so that's when people are grieving together. And we saw that the past couple of years. People were grieving the loss of many things together. Another time in history where we both saw cumulative and collective grief was with like JFK, RFK, and Martin Luther King, right? We've had these moments where we've had different people that have died in succession. We've also had times when superstars or musicians have died in a row. Collective grief when, when Prince died, or when Robin Williams, people grieved together. TV shows, when a character might die, people will grieve. Even though that is fictional, that can be impactful. Anticipatory grief is a grief that's often overlooked and not understood very well. So sometimes we might know somebody is going to die, and so we anticipate that loss, and that grief looks really different. And then once the loss occurs, they transition into a different type of loss. And people don't always understand that there's a transition between the anticipation and the actual loss occurring, and they can look very different. We also have ambiguous grief. Sometimes I just feel like I've lost something and I don't know what it is. This is common also, like I mentioned before, when you might have children or people transitioning from, being a little kid and then going into school, being a school student into post-secondary opportunities, having a colleague that is leaving the workplace. We have these losses and we're like not sure what's going on, but we know that we're feeling that. Normal grief, what's normal grief, right? Normal grief simply is defined as being able to attend to your ordinary expected tasks. Getting up, showering, brushing your teeth, eating, going to work, going to school, doing what you're supposed to do, attending to your daily activities. About 10% of the people will have complicated grief, which is also maybe considered prolonged grief. And so these are definitely things to take in mind. And one here I also want to mention is traumatic. So trauma and grief, I feel like are kind of like cousins, right? They like to hang out together often, but you don't always find them together. But what makes a situation traumatic is the way the person is experiencing that situation. So something might happen to me and to you, and one of us might deem it to be traumatic and the other might not. There was a case a clinician was talking about once where two siblings were in a car and in a car accident, and their adult who was driving was killed in the accident. And one processed that incident as a trauma event and the other did not. And they were in the exact same space at the exact same time, but it's the way that they interpreted it. And so we also can see traumatic grief as well. One I don't have a slide on, but I touched on a little bit before, is secondary loss. So secondary loss is really impactful in a larger social context. So it might have been a dual income family, and now they're a single income family that might have to move to be in a more affordable place, or they might need to move to be closer to supports, or they might need to move away from where they're at because of a toxic or unhealthy relationship with people. Their expectations of what their life looked like can be a secondary loss. They always thought that their parent was going to teach them how to drive and that parent can't teach them how to drive anymore. So when they start driver's ed, they feel that loss. Secondary losses can transcend the span of our life, right? With major life milestones. And so not only is there grief, there's many different types. And so as we talk about grief, which is something we don't do enough of, we often turn away, we shy away. There was a family that we knew, and they came and they were talking about their experiences, and I think they might be in speaking grief as well. And we had a family that watched that and was telling us about their experience being similar, that they would go for a walk and people would all of a sudden look like they were busy doing something because they didn't want to have a conversation with them. And so we don't talk about death. And then when we do, we use euphemisms. So we come up with so many different terms for died, dead, and death. So I want to take a second, and I want you to use the chat, right? I want you to pop in the chat euphemisms that you might have used or you might have heard that referred to death. Transitioned. Kick the bucket. I know I never understood that one. They lost someone. Expired. Crossed over. Yeah, if we lose people, are we going to find them? They're in a better place. I don't know if anyone's country music fans, but Winona the other night had a special, and she was talking about how people would say that her mom was in a better place, and she's like, no, I want her here. This is the best place for her, next to me. Watching over us, 6 feet under. Yeah, there was a whole series on that, right? Croaked. So yeah, we use lots of euphemisms. So when we're talking to kids and others as well, sometimes there's confusion when we use words like we lost them. And especially with kids, like we lose our keys, we lose our, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I lose my keys and phone in a day, right? And I always find them. We also say that our phone is dead, but I simply plug it back in and it springs back to life. So I try, and I'm pretty intentional about it. I say my phone's out of energy because that's what it is, right? When all the bars are gone, it is out of energy and I can plug it back in and it's back alive. And so when we're speaking to youth, they don't always understand what we're saying. And that really can complicate their understanding of the permanence and the concreteness. And then sometimes when we're having casual passing conversations with people, people are left really confused about like, what was that person talking about? So using the proper language is important. But we also need to take in mind some of the cultural considerations that might come with language as well. And in doing so, the NACG has this wonderful languaging guide that's on their website. So it says what we will say oftentimes instead of, and then why. So instead of parents, we should say caregivers or trusted adults, because not every child comes with their parent. And we can't make those assumptions. We don't say committed or completed suicide. We say died by or died from suicide or a suicide death. Using more inclusive pronouns. Instead of assuming he or she, we can use they or them. Instead of brothers and sisters, using siblings. Oops. And so the languaging guide is really helpful, and it also gives the rationale as to why as well. So being intentional and using died, death, and dead versus any of the euphemisms that we had mentioned. And when we use past, right? And like the media does, I love watching the news and watching the reporters talk, and they like sometimes will pause before they say die, death, or dead, or past. But past is often attributed to like spiritual or faith faith beliefs. And if you know what the family is, their faith background, you might be able to reflect that in some of the conversations. But we don't assume that they believe that you move from life here to to heaven or another afterlife, because that is an assumption that we don't necessarily know. So be observant, ask questions, be present and authentic. And so when we don't know or we are curious, we need, actually not when we're curious, you need to be careful with your questions, right? They need to be intentional and they need to be for a good reason, not because you just want to know something. But there are times when we'll ask questions. So we can ask openly when we're unsure what would be helpful for a family. Can you tell me how your family or your culture recognizes and copes with the death of a family member? And so how does this impact what I can do? How can I be helpful? Can you help me understand how I can best be of help to your family? We don't make assumptions because they might not ascribe to those certain assumptions. Being present and authentic. Even if you don't know, we can be there and we can be in that space. Some things that we don't want to say. I know just what you're going through. Instead, you can say, can you tell me more about what this has been like for you? Because even if you had the same parent die, relationship-wise, or they might have died the same manner, you are not them. You do not know what they're going through. It is different for each person. A leading statement would be, you must be incredibly angry. What if they're not? Then are you judging them that they're not angry? How are they going to perceive that statement if that's not true for them? So they might have strong feelings. So you could say something like, most people have strong feelings when something like this happens. What has this been like for you? And then they can give you a range of different feelings that they might have been experiencing. This is hard, but it's important to remember the good things in life too. You could also say, what kind of memories do you have or want to share about your sibling? At least he's no longer in pain. What sorts of things have you been thinking about since your person died? What not to ask first? How did they die? How old were they? What would be a much better first question? It's one that we ask when somebody gives birth or has a child come into their life. We ask, what is their name? That is not a question we lead with when we're speaking to those who have been impacted by a loss. We don't ask what their person's name was. We don't personalize and humanize it because that's bringing them in, that's bringing them close. And for some people that can be really hard. So we need to make sure we're aware of where we stand in our knowledge of companioning and what we can take on. But you can always ask what their name is. And you don't have to follow it up with other questions. Oops. So in grief advocacy, we know that bringing grief into the foreground and embedding grief-informed practices into our workplaces, into our professional work, into our personal work can be life-changing. Everyone loves Mr. Rogers, right? And he said anything, well, we don't want to make that assumption. So many people like Mr. Rogers. So anything that's human is mentionable, and anything mentionable can be more managed, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. When we can talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. And so if we are able to companion and to sit with somebody, that is one of the biggest gifts that we can give. And it's not free, right? Our time is valued. And so we mustn't think of it as something that we give freely. We give it with intention and we give it with purpose. But it is a gift and it is impactful. So what helps? listening, caring, accepting. So one of my mentors always likes to say that we were given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. We should listen twice as much as we talk. So listening, caring, and accepting. Encouraging safe physical expression. They might need to rip up phone books. Who has phone books anymore? Tissue paper works well instead. It's that thinnish paper that you can like rip really easily, or magazines. It's that physical like movement, but it's something that isn't destructive and that we don't necessarily need. Making a high energy emotions basket and keeping that in your house or in a space, might be a classroom or wherever you work, could be something that's needed, right? Depending on what you put in there, you can put those magazines, those tissue paper. You can also, in quiet spaces that you can have loud noises, you can put cups, but make sure if you're doing cups or paper bags that you explain to the child or the people that are hearing that what is going on, because that can be an activating sound and can really be hurtful to people, because sometimes when we pop or step on cups or pop bags, it can sound like gunfire. It's not exactly the same, but that loud, unexpected noise can be really triggering. Actually, not even triggering, it's very activating. So another intentional word, using language, right, intentionally. So when we're working with families that might have been impacted by violence or gun violence, we use in mental health the word triggered all the time. We can use activating as well, and then it doesn't have an association with a gun. And so it's nuanced and it's simple. Dr. Tashal Bordair talks about that a lot. And I can get on board with that one. The one I have a hard time with is she doesn't like bullet points. I get it. She calls them love dots. I've been thinking like, what else can I call them? So I just call them dots or points. I'm trying to move away from calling them bullets, because in the environment that we work in, that can, even to someone you don't know what their experiences are, that can be something that might activate a response in them. As I digress. So encouraging safe physical expression, and having that high energy basket, reflecting back to the child or the adult what they're saying and doing. I see that you're doing X, Y, and Z. I hear that you want this, that, or the other. Modifying expectations with their input. So boundaries and bedtimes and expectations, I feel like they're like Olaf moments, right? They're like warm hugs. And so they really encapsulate the expectations, and they let people know that you care and that you see them. When we let all bedtimes and eat whatever you want, and we let all of those guidelines and rules and things go out the window, then we stop paying attention to what they're doing as much, and we don't see them in the same capacity. And so modifying the expectations with their input, that can also include homework and different maybe workloads that you might have in the workplace, but have their input. Reassuring the person that the death was not their fault. Referring to any supports or therapies. If you are a person referring, do a little bit of groundwork and make sure they're accepting new clients, or when the next group is, or when you give them the list, say, I have not, let them know. It's always better if you kind of flush it out first, but if you didn't have the time or, bandwidth, say, I have not checked on these, but here are some that I've found. So at least they know that there might be a wait list, or it might not be happening at this time. Believe in the return to wellness for the child and or adult, even if they can't. Be that beacon of hope in an appropriate manner. Celebrate the steps towards healing. Be aware of our own grief as helpers. We have to do our own grief work first. As being a companion to those that are grieving, that is paramount and so impactful and important. And allow for timeouts from grief. So sometimes we need to take a timeout as well. I'm looking in the chat quick. Yeah, triggering, like everyone says it now. It's like overused, and yeah, it doesn't necessarily make sense, right? Yeah, and finding out what the expectations were as before the death as well. And they might have been suspended, especially if it was an anticipated loss, or if there was an illness, or if there was a change in routines, or sometimes there's just lifestyles that don't have a lot of boundaries and limits. And so putting them in place in a explained manner can be really helpful. So has anyone heard or seen or said things or done things that were not helpful? And if you had any positive experiences, what might those have been as well?
As you invite them to put that in the chat.
In the chat, or if you'd like
just
to,
unmute.
you can unmute too. Yep.
Okay, I have one thought that is newer. You know, you can be in this field, but things you learn more. The more you go, the more you learn how things change. And one of the things that has been more recent, and I'm not quite good at yet, is the difference between I can't imagine and I can only imagine.
Yeah. That one's huge, right? And so it's
Subtle.
an apostrophe and a T, right? It's not a huge shift but it's huge in the way it's perceived. So when we say I can't imagine, you're jumping. Let me come back to that, okay?
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah.
No, I remember. I'm glad that you brought it up. I promise I'll address it.
Sometimes what my when you've had somebody who's been sick for a long time and and they die, and you have people who are like, oh, they were sick for a really long time. Having had that happen, it's been a very interesting grief experience, because what I didn't expect in my grief, I was, certainly relieved for her, that she wasn't suffering anymore. But what I didn't anticipate in my own grief was I started to grieve like 15 years ago when she was healthy. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh, you just slowly grieve when you have someone go downhill for a long time, and you just do all your anticipatory grief work and get your work done, and it'd be easier at the end. And I was like, oh, it was just suddenly this great missing of what was and what had been, which I didn't expect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a comment in chat. Oh, you will get over it, and it's all right to let out your emotion.
Getting over it, people say it, but they don't necessarily, there's not always a lot of intention behind. We just say it because we think it's comforting, right? You'll get over it. It won't hurt. It's kind of like it's not like we lost a sucker down a manhole, right? Or a quarter rolled and, is gone, and we can get another quarter to get a gumball. Like, that's not how it works. This is something that's with us and, moving through it. And I promise the next slide is your other question.
Okay, it's okay. We can hold on. Keep going through your chat.
Okay. And then at least statements, yes. Lizanne, you have your hand up?
I just put it in chat, Michelle, but it was my dad. He was 94 and he did live a wonderful, amazing life, but that made me feel like I shouldn't really be grieving. Like, when I would get these bursts initially, it really threw me off. And I know this, right? Shoemakers' kids don't have shoes. I actually work in the field. So it was almost like it restricted my grieving. I mean, I worked through it, but it did not help me to hear that. And I would say that in presentations all the time. And then it was like my story. So
yeah.
Minimizing the grief experience. And it doesn't make it easier for the person if it was 94 days or 94 years. It's still hard. They're still missing that connection. And we that is why we lead with the question oftentimes, like, how old was the person? Because we want to see if we ask all of those like inappropriate oftentimes questions. But part of it is because we're human and we want to see if we can identify is like, ooh, it's kind of that like protective factor, like, oh, is that something that can happen to me right at that moment, right? And then we make a decision, yes or no, yes or no, yes or no. But it really doesn't matter. We just shouldn't ask that as a leading question. And people will ask that of people that they don't know. People will say amazingly crazy, horrible things. Celeste, do you have one? Oh, no, I was Camille, sorry. I was reading Camille, like of all people. Sorry, I was trying to go back and I was thinking it was someone else. Miss Camille.
I have been called Celeste before. So
No,
early
that's
on, before we ever had group, there was a boy that came to like one of our first open like picnic that we were kind of introducing ourselves, and his brother had died of suicide. And I walked up and I was talking to the family and I said, well, I've had 3 people die of suicide, and trying, at the time thinking, oh, I'm gonna, relate, right? And thank God the woman that was with them was also a friend of mine. And she called me the next day and she said, Camille, it's not only like you one-upped them, but I was wondering, okay, who else is going to die? We've only had 1, so we got 2 more to go till we meet your quota. It was like, oh, it was a tough lesson. Very humbling, borderline humiliating.
But a powerful relationship that she felt comfortable enough to say that. So thank goodness there's people who will teach us when we don't know.
And that family came for 6-7 years and are my favorite people. And I apologize. I mean, they're amazing. So we do say stupid things and we make mistakes, and if they know our intentions are, for them, we get forgiveness.
That's true. Relationship.
Mm-hmm. I know I have one that I remember all the time, right? I was out one night, it was Halloween, and we were at a restaurant, and this woman I'd been talking to, and I just wasn't in the mood to have a conversation, right? Like, so sometimes we pick and choose what we share with others. And my brother had died. And so she's like, oh, do you have siblings? And I had said, yeah, I have a brother. And I was being aloof. And she's like, does he live around here? And I was like, no. And just really kind of like, we're at a party, like, I don't want to do this. And, I was working in this field. And then she kept kind of asking. So finally I was like, he died. And she's like, oh, so you're an only child like me. And I was like, yeah, I guess so. And I mean, I must, like, sometimes we know in our being, right? Like, but it wasn't funny, but all I could do in that moment was like, oh my goodness. And so I was like, yeah, sure, same thing. And so, yeah, like, we're not always kind to people. And we don't do it out of malice. We do it because we're oftentimes trying to form a connection. But we're not always intentional about that. Kelly, you had some statements too. Yep, you put like at least statements, and then there's some other comments in here as well.
You have to be strong. She says you have to be strong.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of goes with, so that's the people telling you what to do. Like Janae had said, you will get over it. Like they know better. And her other comment had been, it's all right to let out your emotion. Like people are telling you what to do. The same thing. Why do you have to be strong?
Yeah, I feel like it's like rushing somebody through their grief. Like, stuff your grief down, just be strong.
Yeah,
Not helpful.
and then sometimes we like to place archaic beliefs, and some are current beliefs as well, and we'll verbalize those to people, right? What does the church, how does the church judge, or how does the church not judge, and how are you viewed? And
Yeah,
so
can you
those
see
Yeah, those can
Yes.
all be shaming as well. And you know, does it say you?
She said, my
Yeah.
mom died by suicide when I was 12, and a church member said committing suicide is a sin in the church,
Yeah. And
Not
more than
helpful.
likely, she was probably standing in the church at the time, right? Like, people will say things in the most unopportune times as well. And so, yeah, thank you for sharing all those. So Peggy, to answer your question between I can only imagine and I can't imagine, it really is like empathy and sympathy. And I'll show this clip because I love this. Some of you might be familiar with Brene Brown's clip. So when I can't imagine, that means, you know what, it's too big. I could never even put myself in your shoes. Not possible. Can't go there, can't do it. Sorry, you're alone. When you say I can only imagine, that means that your mind and your body and your being is able to feel what they might be feeling. And that's kind of the empathy versus the sympathy, I feel like is the best explanation. So let's see if I can get this to play.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
I don't know if that made any sense. Has anyone ever seen that before?
Yes, I have. Yeah, it's awesome. I love that. It's a great visual, and she does a great job of explaining it.
And I never thought about the difference between I can only imagine and I can't. But now that I know, I hear it all the time. And it's like one of those things I really notice. And it's something that we talk about with our volunteers and those that are assisting with our programming. And so sometimes one of the people I work with said, but I can't imagine that. And I was like, okay, well, like, then you're being intentional with that. And they said, because for me to imagine that would cause me so much distress that I can't go there. And so there are times when it might be very true. And so when we're being authentic and true and intentional, that might be something you say. But if we're just saying it because it's something that we've been socialized to say, then it's, you know, something I would challenge you to really think about what you say.
Kelly noted in chat that both of those statements lack the connection piece. So maybe
Mhm.
instead of trying to not say I can't, maybe there's no reason to say either to a griever. Does it matter if we can imagine or can't imagine?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends on the context, right? Like if someone's asking you a question, then, you know, like that might be your response. But if you're, one of the things that exists in grief and in the grief response world are platitudes. We have so many platitudes, things that we just say because we feel like that's what we're supposed to say. I am so guilty at possibly bad social habits or social norms. When you walk out of a door, like when you're going, you know, the double doors at stores and you walk out the door and you hold it for a second and the person's coming behind you, I can slow down and hold it to when they have it. But sometimes like I like walk and then my like short little arms kind of let it go. And then I'll be like, sorry. No, I'm not. I like, if I was sorry, I would have slowed down and then still missed, like not slowed down enough. But I didn't alter my gait so that you could actually get the door as it was still open. But like, I just say sorry and I don't think about it. And so that's like some of the things that we do in grief response now that I've outed myself with bad social graces, right? But we need to be intentional and thoughtful with what our reactions are. Oftentimes people will say things and we're like, I'm so sorry to hear that. Well, why are we sorry to hear that? Like, are we sorry or are we just saying something because we're expected to respond? And so there's an acronym WAIT, WAIT, and it stands for why am I talking? So sometimes we need to wait before we say something instead of just saying something. And so there's also different types of listening, right? We listen to learn or we listen to respond. And more often than not, we're listening to respond. We're not actually consuming what the person's saying. We're listening to tell them how we can identify with them or form that connection. Oh, your brother died, so did mine. I know exactly how you're feeling. Like we're like, oh, I can respond to this. It's like a game of ping pong or, you know, pickleball or tennis or whatever you might be. Stop. Wait. So being a great listener, you ask questions that promote discovery and insight. You don't just respond. So two-way dialogue. Grief conversations are huge power dynamics. So if we say I'm sorry to somebody, that has a period. It's not a comma, it's usually a statement. And then the ball volleys back to the griever and they have to say, thanks, no big deal, something, right? And then that power is like off balance. So constructive two-way dialogue, interactions that build self-esteem and create safe environments to openly discuss issues or differences. Asking what a person's name might be, and then inviting them, would you like to share something about them with me? That gives the griever the choice to say yes or to say no, depending on the environment. A cooperative conversation back and forth without making each other defensive. And without that like one-upping that sometimes we do. Making suggestions skillfully that open up those alternative paths. What do you miss most about your person? Would you like to share what you miss most about the person? And so that gives them the choice of, yes, I'd like to tell you, or, you know, not at this time. Would you like to talk about your person? Yes or no. They get to pick. A good listener is not a sponge that absorbs, but it's a trampoline that bounces ideas off. Our job is to not take their pain and hold it, because then we're robbing them of their emotions. We reflect what we see, hear, and feel based on the conversation. So the levels of listening: create a safe environment, clear away distractions and make eye contact, understand the substance and ask questions and confirm. Observe nonverbal cues. 80% of communication is nonverbal. If someone's crossing their arms, like really like, they probably don't want to continue that conversation, right? Understand emotions and feelings about the topic. That's where we utilize our empathy and helping the other person to see issues in a different light. So when we're doing reflective listening, especially in maybe a professional environment, when we're working with those that might come to a bereavement program, how we would reflect it is when someone said, "My mom died," you would reflect by saying, "Your mom died." If they said, "My mom passed away," I would say, "Your mom died." They said, "My mom went to heaven," then I might say, "Your mom died and went to heaven." And so they're telling me information, but as we're building that vocabulary sometimes, and this can be nuanced, right? It can be dependent on the relationship you have with the person you're having the conversation with. But if you're in a helping profession or in social work, counseling, hospital setting, or some sort of caregiving setting, this might be the way you most appropriately reflect what they're saying to you. Because they know then, even though they're using their language, they know that you're understanding what they're saying. So the National Alliance for Children's Grief this month, being November, their campaign is all about listening. And so their theme this month is listen on repeat. And so committing to listen and being a really good listener. So they're having some really good presentations over the next couple of weeks. And you can visit the nacg.org website to see them. There's a few of them that are free and streaming on Facebook as well. So we talk a little bit about school. I know we only have a few minutes, but schools are microcosms of the greater environment. And so we know when students go to school that they have difficulty, not all, but some students might have difficulty concentrating in class. Absenteeism increases and quality of work can decrease. And so we need to recognize and meet students where they're at. The NACG has an amazing resource on their website that includes an individualized grief bereavement plan that school counselors, social workers, and the adult caregivers and the child themselves can work on to create their bereavement plan that best suits and supports them. We need to empower more teachers to serve as role models on healthy grieving. So attending presentations like this or anything that the NACG or other organizations might have. Doing a screening of speaking grief. It is amazing, and it's something that they can watch to have a better perspective. The National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement also has great online modules that schools can utilize in their trainings as well. And so then there's also the opportunity to become a grief sensitive school. I'm partnering with the New York Life Foundation. If there's a local agent in your area that's willing to do the training through their New York Life branch, then schools can apply for a $500 grant and receive that to make their school more grief informed. And then once they get that money, they can look at some of their tiered interventions, like their their universal supports, right? Tier 1, or they might do some groups with a tier 2, or might have some push in with grief support centers and such that are doing more targeted tier 3 supports as well. Using bibliotherapy, there's some really great books that you can do both online Zoom groups or in-person Zoom groups, creative expression, hands-on activities. I know Sandcastles does amazing activities, and there's also Pinterest and so many other places to find those as well. We're reaching out to Peggy and her team to get some of those as well. Having plans and protocols in place before, and this also, all of this also can pertain to a workplace, right? We need to have policies and procedures in the workplace. And grief is impactful in our economic setting. It's estimated that grief has a $75 billion price tag every year. And so with days off, lower productivity. And so it's not only in schools to have plans and resources and supports, but it's also in workplace and other community settings as well. So in the Padlet, there are links to many of these resources. And then like that individualized bereavement plan, we'll talk about when a child returns to school and such. And these are all in the Padlet. And just a little bit on companioning. So companioning is when we literally reflect versus taking something in that sponge concept. And so we need to have done our grief work. Everyone is always looking for the toolkit, right? Give me the magic toolkit. It doesn't exist, but the closest thing I've found is on speakinggrief.org. They have some really good short videos from many of the speakers in their documentary. Here's a few of my favorites: the importance of support, child grief in the classroom, your goal as a support person, how to offer support, and that acronym that I talked about before, why am I talking? And so I want you to think about what are some of the things you want the world to know and to do to help make ourselves a little bit more grief informed. So with that, if there's any questions, I thank you so much. I know we're a minute over, but for having me be part of this and all the conversations and all the feedback. You guys were a really interactive group as well. And I know there's people from other grief support centers and grief support programs across the great state of Michigan, and those that have grief experience as well. So thank you all for coming.
Yeah,
And shout
thank
out to
you,
my friend
Michelle.
Camille and Dave. Yep.
Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And thank you, everyone. Now that we're here, you can visit us at aboutsandcastles.org. Michelle also has wonderful Padlet information, which is in the chat. Phenomenal thing. I'd never heard of a Padlet before, and it is like the best encyclopedia ever. So go check it out. And if you need us, you know where to reach us. Give us a call. All right. Thanks, everybody.
I will say with the Padlet, there might be a few broken links because the National Alliance for Children's Grief updated their website. So I've tried to go through. So the title is still something on their website. So you might have to do a little bit of searching. Sorry, they did that without permission. But it's still
Yes,
an amazing, but you can find other great things while you're clicking through it too. So thank you and have a great night.
Thank you. Take care.